Victory Day in Moscow is always a full-on display of choreography, pageantry, and prowess. But this year, more than others, Vladimir Putin wants it to act as a national call to arms, as he again raged against the West, claiming that Russia was the victim.
Today, civilization is once again at a decisive turning point. A real war has been unleashed against our motherland. We have rebuffed international terrorism, and we will protect residents of the Donbass, and we will ensure our security.
Apparently, this is the scaled-back version. An effort to manage heightened security concerns amid a number of attacks on Russian soil. Putin appealed to the patriotism of his soldiers fighting in Ukraine, some of them watching on.
The security of our country rests on you today. The future of our statehood and our people depend on you. You are fulfilling your military duty with honor. You are fighting for Russia.
But beneath the veneer of grandeur, Russia's bungled invasion of Ukraine has left many wondering if parades like this are a weapons fest, papering over the cracks in its armed forces. Putin, for his part, seemed pleased and ended with a rallying call.
For Russia, for our valiant armed forces, for victory, hurrah!
For a closer look, let's talk to geopolitical analyst Samuel Ramani. He teaches politics and international relations at the University of Oxford, and he's the author of the newly published book, Putin's War on Ukraine, Russia's Campaign for Global Counter-Revolution. The book examines the Russian president's motivation for invading Ukraine, and there you can see the cover. Mr. Ramani, good to see you again. What do you make of today's events in Moscow?
Well, I mean, obviously they were a bit anticlimactic given the attacks on the Kremlin, as well as the fact that May 9th parades were being canceled throughout the country. 6 Russian regions, Crimea, and about 21 other cities. So I think that Putin came away with this predictable bellicose rhetoric, comparing the war in Ukraine to the struggle against Nazi Germany decades earlier. But it seemed like a bit of a hollow, empty display.
Some analysts have argued that, as opposed to the usual display of strength, this year's parade exposed Russia's military weaknesses. Would you agree?
I think it absolutely showed Russia's military weaknesses. I think in particular they were noticing the dearth of manpower and tanks and other equipment. So I think that, yes, it definitely did not really show a system of strength. And also, it's important to keep in mind that Russia didn't really have any kind of conventional military successes in Ukraine to boast about this time around. They haven't even taken over Bakhmut. Their only successes over the course of the past calendar year from the last May 9th was taking over part of Luhansk and Soledar, and they've lost Kharkiv and Kherson in the meantime.
Putin said, though, that the West has unleashed a, quote, real war as opposed to his military operation, I'm guessing, against Russia. Is that how Russians see it as well?
Well, that's certainly the propaganda that they've been pushed onto. This is a total hybrid war from the West. One component of it comes from sanctions. Another component of it comes from NATO expansion on Russia's borders, and then culminating into NATO providing military assistance on large scale towards Ukraine. And there's a lot of inflated narratives and misinformation about what that entails. For example, even the presence of NATO forces on the ground, who Russians have allegedly killed, often circulating in the propaganda. So I think that it's believed by a large portion of Russians who have access to limited other information sources, and it's something that Putin needs to keep alive in order to justify why this war is continuing, and also why Russia is not achieving a quick victory in Ukraine.
Putin says Russia's future rests on the shoulders of the soldiers fighting in Ukraine. We heard it there in the report. To what extent could that be true?
Well, I think that that's a bit of a hyperbolic statement because the Russians are trying to convey this as some kind of existential struggle in order to unite people around. There already were some signs, even from the tightly filtered sociological research environment inside Russia, the Levada Center, which are showing that amongst people under the age of 50, there's been rising apathy towards the war. So and that apathy doesn't really go very well when you're trying to mobilize and conscript citizens. The Russian Defense Ministry wants to bring another 400,000 troops onto the battlefield as soon as possible. So I think that that's really why he's kind of making this so existential and making this so dire, because there is apathy towards the war, there is frustration about the losses, and it's really unclear what this war is being fought for. And Vladimir Putin wants to ensure that people are reminded by the fact that there is this kind of phantom threat of Nazism and NATO and the West, and that this is a struggle for survival.
Yeah. Rhetoric and propaganda aside, though, to what extent could the outcome of this war, one way or another, shape the future of Russia?
Well, I mean, I think that if Vladimir Putin is dealt a decisive defeat to the hands of the Ukrainians in the upcoming counteroffensive, and then the Ukrainians move forward to take over large parts of Donbass and threaten Crimea, then I think that they could go one of two ways. I mean, I think the most likely scenario is that there could be a possible intra-elite schism. We're already seeing all the fault lines being emerging within the Russian military between Yevgeny Prigozhin and Valery Gerasimov and Sergei Shoigu play out over the past week. Prigozhin, even today, on May the 9th, as head of the Wagner Group, was talking about how the biggest enemies of Russia are not Ukraine or NATO, but bureaucrats and enemies who lie within, the fifth columns from within. So I think that that could lead to recriminations that emboldens a hardline nationalist takeover. And there's a smaller chance, of course, that this causes the Russian people to really come to their senses and start resisting this war. But I think that given the level of coercion and given the amount of propaganda, I think that the first is more likely than the second.
Yeah. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy commented on the pomp and pageantry displayed there in Moscow today. I want us to listen in and then get your thoughts.
In my opinion, the Russian Federation, their military and political leadership needs something to sell to their people because they have no victories to boast of. They could not sell Bakhmut because they could not capture it. That was their last really important operation, and they wanted to do it by May 9th.
Is this really about selling something to the Russian public? Because there is wide consensus among analysts like yourself that apathy regarding the war is taking hold in the public.
Well, I mean, obviously, Russia, if it could sell a victory, it would want to. But I think that we overestimate the degree to which May 9th is an artificial target for Russia. There was always a lot of talk about that last year, too, that May the 9th there'd be some kind of a grand announcement like potential mobilization. But that didn't take hold. So this is a symbolically important milestone, obviously, and it feeds into the propaganda about how this war is comparable to the Second World War. But we shouldn't read too much into the setting of benchmarks around artificial deadlines, because last year and this year, it's really done nothing to change Russia's policy, or really Russia's rhetoric from that point of view.
We've heard time and time again that this war will not be won on the battlefield by either side, and there has been much discussion about China taking on a more active role in ending the conflict. Today, China's foreign minister was in Germany and said this. Take a look.
The Ukraine issue is highly complex and cannot be resolved in a simple or emotional way. Only by keeping level-headed and rational and creating conditions for political settlements can we end the crisis. China is not the creator or a party to the conflict, but a promoter of peace.
China, a promoter of peace. They haven't done much to that effect, have they?
Well, China basically released a symbolic 12-point peace plan, which was viewed by many, particularly in the West and also in Ukraine, as basically giving a carte blanche to Russia because it legitimized the occupation of Russian territory. Of course, it included support for sovereignty of Ukraine, but when you're calling for a ceasefire, freezing the current battle lines, you're clearly violating Ukrainian sovereignty. So as you can see, it's riddled with contradictions. It looks more like an appeasement of Russia than an actual peace plan. There may be some elements in which of the Chinese peace plan that might be able to get more of a serious hearing, like the really strong words about Russia not using tactical nuclear weapons, or potentially dealing with the situation on Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, where we've just seen explosives being placed near the plant, and now the plant almost effectively suspending operations. But on the grand bargain, the ceasefire, I think that the Russians and the Ukrainians are both not really in a position to negotiate. The Ukrainians believe they can win, and this is their historic opportunity. And the Russians are unwilling to admit that they really can't win at this point.
At this point, what would be a realistic path to peace, even if it's a far way down the road?
So I think the first step would obviously be to deal with some of the secondary issues that we're seeing around the war itself and then go to the frontline situation. So I think that some kind of a long-term stabilization of the Black Sea grain export deal would be something that would be quite encouraging. Obviously, the Russians are threatening to scrap that deal on the 18th of May, but that's been the biggest diplomatic achievement that's been achieved so far, and that was something that Turkey brokered. So being able to come up with some kind of agreement that allows Russian grain and fertilizer out through the markets and also prevents Russia from using blockades and other forms of brinkmanship to derail food exports, then something on Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, and maybe then probably some kind of a movement towards a grand bargain. But if it's a grand bargain that freezes the conflict and leaves Russian forces occupying parts of Ukraine, there'll always be the fear that Russia will just ignite another war like this when it rearms and it's in a stronger position.
Samuel Ramani of the University of Oxford. A complicated picture you paint there, but thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you very much.